All right, let's continue where we left off. Uh, Nehemiah chapters 1 through 7. And I'll open the lecture again. Okay. Nehemiah 1 through 7. Rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. A new character enters the story. Nehemiah, Artaxerxes' cupbearer, hears that Jerusalem lies in ruins. This news bothers him so much that he asks the king's permission to go rebuild the city. Artaxerxes agrees, but asks him to come back when the task is done. He also gives Nehemiah official letters that validate his mission and some vital construction material, as well as making Nehemiah's governor or making Nehemiah governor of Israel. So once in Jerusalem, Nehemiah wastes no time as he surveys Jerusalem and sees what must be done. He knows that two local enemies of Israel, Sanballat and Tobiah, are opposed to his rebuilding efforts. Nehemiah encourages the people to work despite opposition from these enemies, as well as from Geshem the Arab. He supervises construction all over Jerusalem with the main goal of rebuilding the city walls so Jerusalem will be safe from attack. Four obstacles soon arise. First, Sanballat and his friends ridicule the workers, yet the laborers continue undaunted. Second, the enemies threaten violence against Jerusalem, so Nehemiah arms the workers with swords. Third, several people want to stop building so they can harvest crops, since many of them owe money to unjust lenders. Nehemiah eases the situation by forcing the lenders to stop charging the people interest. Fourth, the enemies try to discredit or intimidate Nehemiah. He ignores them, stating he must finish his work and scorning their threats. Once the wall is finished, he appoints gatekeepers and counts the people. Through his courageous leadership, Nehemiah has helped Israel reach a new stage of restoration with a temple and capable religious and civic leaders. Let's turn to Nehemiah 8 through 13, rebuilding Israel's spiritual life. 2. Ezra and Nehemiah worked together for an unspecified amount of time. Both men stress the importance of repentance and worship. They help the people renew their covenant with Yahweh. Ezra and the priests read and explain the law while standing on specially built platforms. The people confess their national sins and plead for forgiveness while agreeing to follow God in their restored land. Unfortunately, human sin is persistent. While Nehemiah is back in the court of Artaxerxes, the people sin again. The high priest allows Tobiah to live in the temple. Support for the Levites and the temple decreases. The Sabbath is broken, and the people marry idolaters again. Nehemiah corrects these errors when he returns. And let's look at the conclusion. Ezra and Nehemiah demonstrate that Israel can emerge from the devastation of exile by appreciating the efforts of the first exiles to return, by insisting on religious and marital purity, by following determined and visionary leaders, and by obeying God's word and renewing the covenant. Though these tasks demanded discipline and perseverance, they were keys to overcoming great obstacles at that time and remain so today. Okay, now we turn to chapter 22, First and Second Chronicles, how to view the past. The plot. Before its fall, Israel experiences its greatest era during David's and Solomon's reigns. After its divisions, the kingdom still enjoys great kings like Hezekiah and Josiah. Even some wicked kings turn to God before they die. Let's turn to the introduction. The Old Testament story of Israel ends on a positive note. Now that the people are back in the land, struggling to live like Yahweh's people, they need inspiration to move forward. Chronicles indicates that they need inspiration and hope from Israel's heritage. It discusses the best of the nation's past and challenges each new generation to build on this strong foundation. It may initially seem that Chronicles is virtually identical with much of the books of Kings and Samuel. Though they tell several of the same stories, there are striking differences. In Chronicles, most of the leaders' sins are not mentioned. Rather, their best characteristics are emphasized. There is also little information about northern Israel, so there's more focus on the southern kingdom of Judah. Rather, let's see. Or in addition to citing kings, the author of Chronicles also cites many Old Testament books, even giving genealogies from Genesis that begin with Adam. The writer of Kings portrays Israel as a severely flawed nation. The author of Chronicles, in contrast, focuses on how Israel, at its best, rose above these faults by seeking the Lord. This approach aimed to give future generations the sense that they too could do great things for God as they seek to know and serve Him. Let's look at First Chronicles 1 through 9, Israel's ancestors. This section lists the major figures in Israel's past, quoting genealogies from Genesis. It begins with Adam, continues through Jacob's sons, and includes David's family. The genealogy ends with a list of Levites who worked at the tabernacle. Now we turn to First Chronicles 10 through 29, David's reign and God's promises to David. Much of this material appears in Samuel, but several differences are important to note, which help explain Chronicles' view of Israel's history. First, Saul's career is covered only briefly, serving as a prelude to David. Second, Chronicles offers a longer account of how David brings the ark to Jerusalem than Kings does. Chronicles focuses on David's role as benefactor of the sanctuary. Third, the text says nothing about David's affair with Bathsheba. David's character remains unsoiled. Fourth, in taking the census, David is stated to have been moved by Satan rather than God. Fifth, David is described as having gathered all the materials for the temple so that Solomon only has to build the structure. David is presented as the patron of orderly, centralized worship. Finally, God's promise to David of an eternal kingdom becomes the focal point of the rest of the book. The Davidic promise becomes the anchor for the rest of Israel's history. Let's turn to 2 Chronicles 1 through 9. Solomon's reign. Solomon's life is portrayed in a basically positive way. He asks for and receives wisdom from Yahweh. As a result of his wisdom, Israel enjoys unprecedented prosperity. Most importantly, he builds the temple. Solomon follows his father's example of caring for Israel's worship center. Chronicles does not mention Solomon's later idolatries. Rather, it stresses his days of faithful service to Yahweh, allowing him to die with dignity, honor, and esteem. Let's turn to 2 Chronicles 10 through 36. Division, Fall, and Restoration. This portion of the book deals almost exclusively with Judah's kings. Samaria's rulers are only mentioned when they are important in Judah's history. Samaria again refers to the northern kingdom of Israel. Hezekiah and Josiah are great figures in Chronicles, just as they are in Kings. Other, less righteous kings are treated more positively in Chronicles. Most notably, Manasseh repents after a time of exile in Babylon. Now we know him as probably the most evil king from the books of Kings, but Chronicles says that he repented and turned back to God at the end of his life. Certainly, Chronicles does not gloss over all the king's faults. Rehoboam acts unwisely. Ahaz remains rebellious until his death. Jeroboam and Ahab are still wicked men. These negative assessments demonstrate Chronicles' basic honesty. Chronicles deals with Jerusalem's destruction briefly, not dwelling on this catastrophe. Instead, it closes with Cyrus's decree that Israel can return home and rebuild the temple, and encourages all who can to rebuild the land and recapture the glory of the past. Let's look at the conclusion. The past can be viewed in many ways. It can be looked upon with regret, or it can be viewed as a picture of glory that spurs us on to new heights. Chronicles believes that exiles must embrace the goodness of their heritage. They can be grateful for brilliant leaders, a beautiful temple, and an eternal covenant. At the same time, they must avoid the failures of the past. In a real sense, all who read the Old Testament need to adopt the attitude of Chronicles. We know of Israel's and our own sin and how it led to punishment. We have learned the Old Testament figures were not perfect. Still, as Chronicles stresses, we must look beyond punishments to renewal. God always works towards restoration and hope as we seek Him and the truth of His promises. Embracing these concepts is the key to grasping the purpose of Chronicles and understanding the entire Old Testament. Okay, that concludes our lecture. We'll look at the biblical text for this week, which is 2 Chronicles 36, 15 through 23. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, and did not spare young men or young women, the elderly or the infirm. God gave them all into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successors until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested, until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord, spoken by Jeremiah. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, The Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says: The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem and Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them. So that is what we see the conclusion of the book of Second Chronicles. And if you compare the ending of Second Chronicles with the beginning of the book of Ezra, you see that Ezra picks up where Second Chronicles leaves off and continues the story of Israel as it returns from exile. Uh, all right, so that is the text for today. Now, for the attendance assignment this week, again, please write 1 to 2 paragraphs and 1 page maximum to answer the question: what is a main idea you took from this week's lecture? All right, and for the extra credit assignment for this week, according to this text of Second Chronicles that we just read, what was the reason for the fall of Jerusalem? Why did God allow Jerusalem to fall? And how did God try to prevent this event? And number 2, despite the fall of Jerusalem, what signs of hope do we see at the end of this book? How does this passage connect to the history of Israel after the exile? Okay, so that is the end of the lesson for this week. We still have time to cover a study session for the final exam next week. So let me open that and we'll go over it. So this is the study guide for the Old Testament survey final exam. Again, remember, you do not need to submit answers to the study guides to the instructor, and you will not earn credit for doing so. So please don't send me the answers for this. This is just the study guides meant to help you prepare for next week's exam. So you can do this if you want, answer these questions to get yourself ready for the exam next week. If you prefer just to wait for the exam, that's fine too, but you don't need to send me anyways the answers to this. I'm not going to give you credit if you do, or any extra points or anything like that. And you do still need to submit the regular attendance assignment that I just gave you. So don't substitute this, sending this to me instead of that. Send me the regular assignment and then just keep this for yourself to prepare for the test. So the test will include mostly multiple choice, true and false, and a small number of matching questions. There will also be a few short essay questions and some questions for extra credit. It will be pretty similar to the midterm. So if you know, if you took the midterm and you're familiar with that form, the final will be fairly similar in form, but it will cover only the second half of the class, not the first part, only the last 3 lectures since the midterm. So the study guide gives actually 36 questions from which the main test questions will be drawn. If you can answer these questions, you should be able to answer the main test questions. Extra credit questions may be drawn from additional class notes not included on the study guide. So I'll take most of the main test questions, probably all of them, from the study guide, but there may be a few for extra credit that are not on the study guide. So keep that in mind. And it's always good to review and have a basic understanding of all the material. So the following questions will be multiple choice, true or false, or matching. And the first ones will come from lecture 5. Number 1, which prophet was swallowed by a fish after running from God's assignment to the enemy people. Number two, which prophet marries an unfaithful woman to illustrate Israel being unfaithful to God? Number three, the shortest Old Testament book is blank, which highlights Edom's hatred of Israel. Number four, which prophet sees visions of God's glory leave the temple and later return, as well as a picture of Israel as a valley of bones that assembles and is restored to life. Number five, the third part of the Hebrew Bible is known as the blank. Number six, the blank consists of worship songs organized into five parts. Number seven, in the book of blank, a righteous man deals with horrible suffering, contradicting the traditional view that God always rewards the faithful and punishes the wicked. Number eight, the prophet blank calls the people to prioritize building God's temple over building their own homes. Number nine, the prophet blank describes eight visions and emphasizes Jerusalem's renewal. Number 10, the prophet blank calls for justice for the poor. Number 11, the prophet blank responds to new sinful patterns and corrupt worship after the temple is rebuilt, while foretelling God's sending of a messenger who is identified with Elijah. Number 12, the prophet blank prophesies after a locust plague devastates the land and foretells the giving of God's Spirit to all people. Okay, the next batch of questions will come from lecture 6. Number 13, the book of blank contains wise sayings about how to live a faithful and successful life. Number 14, which king is linked to the book of Proverbs? Number 15, should the Proverbs be seen as promises or guarantees of how things will work? Let's say yes or no question. Number 16, by remaining with her mother-in-law during times of personal hardship, Blank eventually becomes an ancestor of King David. Number 17, Blank is the kinsman redeemer who marries Ruth. Number 18, Blank begins pessimistically by declaring life is meaningless before advocating enjoying simple pleasures and ending with the instruction to fear God and keep his commands. Number 19, is the author of Ecclesiastes clearly identified? Again, that's yes or no. Now, there may be a traditional view about Ecclesiastes, but uh, does the book itself clearly say who wrote it? So check on that and see, make sure you know if that author is identified. Number 20, Blank is a series of love poems set in a dramatic framework. Number 21, many interpreters have seen the Song of Songs as a or an blank describing God's love for his people. Number 22, blank describes Jerusalem's destruction in a poetic manner. And number 23, is the author of Lamentations identified? So again, there may be a traditional view, but does the book itself name its author? So check on that. Be sure you can answer that question. Number 24, according to Proverbs, how should learners begin their search for wisdom? So what attitude or characteristic should they have as the foundation for wisdom? Okay, and now we turn to next batch of questions, which come from lecture 7, or today's lecture. Number 25, blank led Israel in rebuilding the wall in Jerusalem. Number 26, in blank, Israel's existence is threatened and must be saved by a Jewish girl who becomes the wife of the Persian king. Number 27, does the book of Esther mention God? Number 28, Esther also describes the origin of blank, a Jewish festival celebrating Israel's victory over its enemies. Number 29, blank is an apocalyptic book which stresses the distant future, claims God orders history, and uses symbolic language. 30, does the Hebrew canon include Daniel and the prophets, the second section of the canon, along with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Book of the 12, as Daniel in that section, the prophets. Number 31, a priest named blank reestablishes the law of Moses in Israel after the exile around 458 BC. Number 32, blank is the governor who leads over 40,000 Jewish people to return to Israel after the exile. Number 33, blank discusses the best of the nation's past and challenges each new generation to build on this strong foundation. Number 34, does Chronicles emphasize the sins of Israel's leaders as is done in Kings? Number 35, Chronicles ends where Ezra begins, with the decree of blank that Israel can return home and rebuild the temple. And number 36, blank is the relative that raises Esther and requests that she speak to the king over the plot to destroy the Jews. Okay, so that will cover all of the, or at least most, if not all of the multiple choice, true and false, and matching questions that you'll see on the test. Now, again, I'll give you a few short essay questions. So the following may appear as short essay questions, and then other short essay questions may be taken from the homework assignments, the extra credits questions I've given you about the texts. So these three I've given you possible examples here. There's number 1, be able to write about something that you learned from the second half of the course. So the last 3 sessions since the midterm exam. Number 2, in the prophets, how does God show he is Lord of all nations, not just the Jewish people? And number 3, reflecting on the writings such as Psalms, Lamentations, and Job, what role does lament have in the worship of God? Okay, that will be some possible. Those are some possible essay questions, and there again there may be others taken from the extra credits. Let's see. So that concludes the study guides for next week's final exam. So uh, hopefully you'll be ready. We'll send the exam to you. It should be next week on Monday. And again, submit the exam to me by the following Friday, and also submit the research paper to me by that Friday if you have not done so. Now, I know not everybody does the research paper, and it is possible to get by without doing it, and I have given you plenty of extra credits throughout the course to get the best possible grades. But to get the best possible grade, you will need to do the research paper. And it's also just good practice to be able to write and know how to write a paper that will serve you well um, in terms of your education, being able to write a paper. And being able to write is a good skill to have and will serve you also well in the workplace. So I do recommend taking the time to write that, and then be sure you use the number of sources I recommended. It's also good to quote from the sources and include quotes in your paper, and be sure that you can quote appropriately according to a proper citation guide, such as the Turabian Guide. So please get that paper to me. And again, I will accept any um, assignments you have not yet completed um, through a week from Friday. So please go ahead and finish those and send them to me as soon as you can. I think I'm fairly well caught up on grading, at least since last week. Maybe those of you who have submitted assignments over the weekend, I may not have responded to yet, but I'll get back to you the next few days. Hope you all enjoyed this class. This is again our last lecture. So next week is only the final exam, no lecture. Hope you've learned a lot about the Old Testament, and this has taught you about the Christian Bible as well as the Jewish Bible, but also has given you a foundation for Christianity and how to compare that. So maybe some of you are Christians, maybe some of you did not know anything about Christianity, but hopefully you've all learned something by now, and hopefully this makes you interested to want to learn more. We will probably add a few more Christian theology classes into the curriculum. So I'm sure I'll be teaching New Testament, the rest of the Christian Bible that focuses specifically on Jesus and his followers sometime in the near future. Um, I think in the spring, I'll be teaching a graduate class on comparing Buddhism and Christianity. So I'm not sure when I'll teach the undergraduates again, maybe summer or fall. But again, I hope you've enjoyed this class. And if you have any questions about the class or other matters, maybe if you ever just want to ask questions or discuss more about Christianity, feel free to contact me. And if I can ever do anything else for you, feel free to contact me. Again, thanks for taking this class. This is our final lecture, so wish you all the best.